All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us over your lunch hour. My name is Marissa Westbrook, and I'm with the CPHA Health Equity Coalition. As a part of our Professional Development Committee, we host these monthly webinars, so if this is your first one, thank you for joining us. What I'd like to do first is pass off the mic to Jason Vitello. Looks like he's unmuted already to give us an introduction to the webinar series and introduce our speaker today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is CPHA's Health Equity Monthly Webinar. I want to remind you all that a list of topics was presented at last year's Public Health in the Rockies. Topics related to health equity, and folks indicated that they really wanted a better understanding of how to advance equity efforts within the legislature, and wanted a primer on how to engage in that process in Policy and Politics 101. Very, very important. So thank you for being here with us, and thank you for joining us. We have a wonderful presenter today, Allie Morgan, and she is the Director of Legislative Services at the Colorado Health Institute. And she is going to present the legislative process in a simple, informative, and easy to understand way. She will discuss policy and politics, including the most effective ways to engage with your legislators. The CPHA policy directors will join us on the webinar as well to discuss upcoming opportunities and ways to get involved, including our Public Health Day at the Capitol coming up soon. So thanks again.
All right. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
That's great. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here with you today. I also have a colleague in the room with me, so just wanted to briefly introduce Eli Boone.
Hi, everybody.
If you hear any typing on a keyboard, Eli is just here taking some notes and checking out the webinar with me today. So I think I have 35 to 40 minutes with all of you to talk about the political landscape, the policy process, and then opportunities for you to get involved in that process at both the state and the local levels. I know that there is a lot to cover here, and there also are questions that might be specific to your involvement or to CPHA or the policy committee that I might not be able to answer. So as was mentioned, there will be directors and others on the call who can help you if you have specific questions or might want to provide additional information to what I'm going to share with you today. I know that we have a wide variety of public health professionals on the webinar, and I think it's also going to be recorded and available for later use. So I wish I could talk to you all and learn where you work and what you do, but I hope that this is going to be applicable to a wide variety of you, depending on your work. I know this will look a little bit different, and I know you all probably have different backgrounds and experiences in this, but this is really sort of an introduction, but I also hope might have some good tidbits for those who have worked a little bit more with the political and policy process. I'm going to cover a lot of ground. I do have a lot of slides, so most of them go pretty quickly. So I will probably ask to hold questions until the end, unless Marissa or someone else wants to take a break and take any questions. I'm fine to do that, but want to make sure that we get through the content and then would be happy to chat after. So anything before we get started? Great. So just a quick bit about the Colorado Health Institute. Hopefully most of you are already familiar with CHI, but if you're not, we're an independent, nonprofit, and nonpartisan health policy research institute. So we serve as a community benefit. We work a lot with policymakers, especially state legislators. We also work with county commissioners and industry and stakeholder groups and interested community members and coalitions. So we do a lot of presentations like this. And because we are nonpartisan, that means that we don't lobby at all or take positions on bills or ballot initiatives or candidates. And so that gives us a good position to give you this presentation today to kind of talk about this from an objective point of view. How does this work? What have we learned? And then if you have specific questions about advocacy strategies, that would probably be better for one of the directors to cover. So that's where I'm coming from today. If you've ever watched a CHI presentation, we always start and end with 3 takeaways because, as I mentioned, I'm going to cover a lot of ground in the next 35 minutes or so. So 3 overarching things to remember from today are that first, Colorado was hit by this blue wave politically in the November elections, and our state is looking pretty blue right now as a whole. But politics are a lot more complicated at the local levels, and depending on where you look in Colorado at the different processes, at the different political affiliation, it doesn't necessarily look like a blue state. Second is that bills follow a track from introduction to passage, potentially, especially in the state legislature, but also at city and other levels. But that track includes a lot of unspoken rules and caveats. And so I'll talk about what some of those are today. That's not to make you jaded about the policy process, it's to help you understand how things are supposed to work and then how they sometimes actually work so that you can be informed as you follow and engage in the policy process. And third, there are lots of opportunities to get involved in Colorado. We have pretty accessible forms of government here. We have a lot of good government laws that I won't go over in detail today, but it's a great state to get involved in the policy process. So I hope you feel empowered to do so after today. And then one note before I get started, I often get questions about this difference between big P and little p policy. This just refers to the fact that policy can take a lot of different forms. Some of those require a formal legislative process and legislative approval, that's that big P policy piece, and others don't. So there can be programmatic changes, organizational policies, community-based policies that don't necessarily need to involve a legislative process or get some sort of outside approval from an authority. So we'll be talking mostly about this big P policy today, how that works through the legislative process, but keep in mind that there are many policy changes that are little p policy as well. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about the politics. I'm going to focus more of the presentation today on the state level than at the local level, but I will touch on the local level a bit as we go through. So people often ask, why do we need to talk about politics? I just want to focus on policy. I want to make good policy. I want to stay out of the political debates. And that sounds really nice, and I wish it were that way too. But unfortunately, you really can't talk about policy without talking about politics. And understanding the political dynamics and realities in which you're working are really critical for being effective in following and influencing the policy process. So that's why we're starting with the politics. Colorado has been called the perfect example of a purple state in recent years by many at the national level. So for 4 years going into last November, Colorado had a moderate Democratic governor, a state legislature that was split control, so the House has been controlled by Democrats, the Senate narrowly controlled by Republicans. If you look at our congressional delegation, Colorado's had 1 Democratic senator and 1 Republican senator, and then we had 4 Republican congressmen in the House and 3 Democratic congressmen in the House. And so we've been split about as close as you can get. We also have this really strong libertarian streak. And so people have looked at the state as a whole and said, this really is the most perfect example in the country of a so-called purple state. I think, however, after the last election that a lot of people are wondering, are we still purple? What does this mean? So if you look, for example, at the election results, we still have a Democratic governor now, but he is much more openly progressive and I think ambitiously progressive than Governor John Hickenlooper, who was at the head for the last 8 years. The power balance in our congressional delegation has flipped. So instead of having 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats in the US House, we have 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. I think I just said that correctly. We used to have 3 Republicans. We used to have 4 Republicans, and now we have 3. And then our state legislature, the House is still under Democratic control, and the Senate has now been flipped to Democratic control as well. So state government is looking very blue right now, and a lot of people are just wondering, you know, what does that make us? Is it still fair to call our state purple? Are we just blue? And so there's a quote that I heard a few days after the election by a local political commentator and strategist that I really liked. And he said, Colorado is not a blue state. It's not a red state. It's also not a purple state. Colorado is a swing state. And that's something that I think a lot of people would agree with. We have seen instances in the past of Colorado being more red or more blue, but those have rarely lasted very long. It's often sort of swung back at the next election cycle or the next presidential election cycle. Coloradans have often not wanted to see a lot of single party control. And so I think the question is just kind of up in the air about what we are, what color are we, what does that mean? And it'll be really interesting to see what happens going forward at a state level if we continue to look blue or if that pendulum swings back a little bit more the other way. Going to dive a little bit into the state legislature here, just so everyone is on the same page about who we have serving in the legislature, how many seats, and what that party control looks like. The Colorado State House of Representatives is split into 65 districts, 1 representative per district. It is controlled by Democrats, as I mentioned. It's been that way for quite some time, and Democrats recently widened their lead. So they're pretty firmly in control of the Colorado House right now. And when you look at a map, the blue parts of that map, so the seats held by Democrats, are basically heavily concentrated in the Denver metro region, some other parts of the Front Range like Fort Collins and Boulder and Pueblo, some mountain communities, and then down in the San Luis Valley by like Alamosa and Salida. I unfortunately don't have an updated map showing party control after the elections. That's on my wish list to get soon. But this is what our state legislature looked like, or our state house, excuse me, going into the elections. And this hasn't changed a whole lot. Most of the seats that Democrats picked up were around the Denver metro area and suburbs. And so you can see again that the blue is fairly concentrated on this map along the Front Range and then in some of those mountain communities. All those red districts are held by Republicans or were going into the election, and then a few of those have switched to blue. Looking at the Senate, there are 35 districts, each with 1 senator, so those two numbers add up nicely to 100. Most states don't have exactly 100. That's a nice thing about Colorado. The Senate, as I mentioned, is now also controlled by Democrats. For the last 4 years, it was narrowly controlled by Republicans. Last legislative session, it was a single vote that Republicans had in control. And then this is pretty similar for Senate districts. That is, the Senate districts are blue in the Denver metro area, some other parts of the Front Range, again, Fort Collins, Boulder, Pueblo, and then in a very large mountain district, which is Senate District 5. Again, I apologize that I don't have an updated map yet, but this looks pretty similar this year as it did going into the 2018 election. And the point of this is that when you look at our states split into districts like this, most people wouldn't say, oh, that's a blue state, right? Or even that's a purple state. It looks like a pretty red state. And so I think the more local of a level in which you look at policy and you look at politics, Colorado has a reputation for compromise that's been great nationally, but it also can be pretty partisan and pretty divided in some parts of the state. And there are large swaths of the state that are controlled by one party or another. There's a lot going on this slide, but this is just a snapshot of all the seats in the General Assembly. So that's the House and the Senate put together. You can see in the House that you need 33 votes to pass a bill. I believe there are 41 Democrats this year, so they have that pretty much in the bag unless they have bills that are splitting their caucus up ideologically. In the Senate, you need 18 votes to pass a bill. There are now 19 Democrats. So that makes things a little bit closer. If there's a bill that the entire Democratic caucus doesn't agree on, they won't have a lot of room for error to get things through the Senate. The Speaker of the House on the left is Representative Casey Becker. She's a Democrat, has served in the legislature for quite some time. And President Leroy Garcia is the top Democrat in the Senate on the right. He's from Pueblo. Both of them have been sort of tangentially involved in health policy issues. I don't believe either has ever sat on one of the health committees in the state legislature, but they're interested in issues like paid family leave for Representative Becker, and Senator Garcia has spent a lot of time looking at like provider scope of practice issues. So they're interested in health policy, but I wouldn't call either necessarily a health policy expert. This is a snapshot from our end of session report after the 2018 session ended. And the main point here is that we look at a lot of bills every year in Colorado. Our 100 state legislators typically introduce about 700 pieces of legislation in every 120-day session. So I think we've got about 215 bills or so in so far in 2019, which means we've still got close to 500 more to go. And you can see, looking at the bottom, that last session there was almost a 60% success rate, so almost 60% of those 721 bills passed. That was in a split control legislature where many Democratic priorities died in the Senate and many Republican priorities died in the House. We'll be looking to see how that changes this year with Democrats in control of both chambers. It will likely go up, probably around 70% instead of 60 is what we've seen in the past. Understanding the committee structure is really important for knowing the policy process and understanding how to follow bills at a state level. So I wanted to touch on that quickly. There are many legislative committees and many that can consider bills on a given topic. So for example, you might have a bill that deals with children and youth. That could go to a health committee, to judiciary committee, to education, to finance, or to a combination of those. Bills sometimes will go to 2 or occasionally even 3 committees in just the House or just the Senate. And often looking at where they are sent first tells you a lot about their chances. Where the roadblocks are in terms of bills, where you should be worried, I guess, if you're following a piece of legislation, are these state affairs committees. The long name for those is the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee. They have that in both the House and the Senate. So just last session, the House State Affairs Committee killed about 40 bills, which was a lot, and the Senate State Affairs Committee killed 95 bills, which was a ton. And the argument from leadership on both sides is that anything can be considered a state affair. And so typically, especially in sessions where there's split party control, the bills that the party in control of a chamber doesn't want to get through, they'll just send straight to the State Affairs Committee. And bills do pass there, but it's sort of a concerning sign if you're following some legislation. So happy to answer more questions on committees later if anyone has them. So that is all I'm going to say about politics at the state level, and then wanted to touch on politics at the local level, which I'm going to talk about at the municipal level briefly. One note about how this is different is that City Council, which is the policy-making body I'm going to talk about today, is really designed in virtually every city in Colorado, I believe, to be nonpartisan or apolitical. So if you look on the website, they don't list the party affiliation typically of anyone who sits on City Council. They don't run as a Democrat or a Republican or a Libertarian. However, that doesn't mean that city councils are free from partisan political dynamics. And so understanding that just depends on the area. Denver is very different from Grand Junction, for example, and Pueblo is very different from Denver. And they have long histories of party control, even though those parties are not supposed to be front and center in terms of their representation on the council. So I'm going to look at both Denver and Pueblo today just to give you a couple examples. Depending on where you live, your city council may operate totally differently, or it may be similar to this. So Denver City Council, to give you an idea, has 13 members on it. 11 of them are from equally populated districts, and then 2 of them are elected at large, so by everyone in Denver to represent the interests of the city as a whole. You have to have lived in Denver for at least 2 years to serve on Denver City Council, and all the seats are up for election every 4 years there. This is a map just showing how the districts are divided up, and so if you live in Denver, you might recognize your neighborhood here. So again, each of these 11 districts has 1 city council representative, and then 2 in addition are elected to represent the city at large. Denver has city council committees in a similar way to our state legislature. So these committees meet to debate and prepare a variety of proposed laws. They don't have as many as the legislature, but you can see there are 4 major committees here. Each of them sort of melts together a couple different topics that they feel are often related or have similar interests. And so they do meet as committees, and they'll talk about ordinances there. They also sometimes have committees on special issues. And so Recent examples of this in Denver have been special issues committees on marijuana and on the Green Roofs Initiative that you may remember voting for in 2016, I believe, if you live in Denver. So that's an example of how it works here. This is where I'm based today in Denver. Pueblo is a little bit different. So looking at Pueblo, they have 7 members as opposed to 13. They have 4 from equally populated districts and then 3 elected at large to represent the city as a whole. So this is a closer balance to sort of district versus city than you see on the Denver City Council. You have to have lived in Pueblo for at least a year to serve on that city council. Remember, it was 2 in Denver. Their terms are staggered and they last 4 years each. Just an interesting note about Pueblo. Yesterday, I believe, they had a mayoral election and they are making a pretty big change to their city form of government. They're going to what's called a strong mayor form of government, where their city council is actually going to lose quite a bit of power. And so if you're interested in that, I just heard a story on the results this morning while I was driving into work, and that's really going to change how their city council operates. So I'm not talking about the mayor today, but that's also a big piece of this equation. This is a map of Pueblo City Council districts. So you can see it's the same concept as Denver. They're split up by neighborhoods, they're census tracts, and then each one of these has a dedicated representative. And then in addition, they have those at-large Pueblo City representatives. City Council committees here don't exist. So Pueblo Council always meets as a full group, and they consider bills as a whole body. So this is just something that, again, depends a lot on where you live, and it's worth studying that process or just going to a meeting or sitting down with someone who can explain it to you in more detail. Okay, so that was the politics at the state level. Just going to give everyone a second to breathe because, again, I know I'm going pretty quickly through this and covering a lot of information. If you have questions, feel free to write them down, or if someone's monitoring a chat box, I'm happy to get to those a little bit later. So we're going to talk about the policy process now. So now that we understand sort of where the seats are, how people meet in groups to consider bills, where the party control is, let's talk about how bills actually get passed. So we're going back now to the state level, which again is where I'm assuming more of you are probably working or going to work. This is our state capitol in Denver. They have great free tours every day. I would highly recommend it if you haven't been and you want a little field trip, just to go sit and watch legislators on the floor, learn about the history of the building. This is a great activity to do, I think, with staff or with your family. So just gonna throw a plug out there for that. State level tools for policy include bills. So this is what we typically think of when we think about state policy. They become acts when they're signed by the governor. Resolutions, which look similar to bills but don't carry the same legal weight. They're formal statements of intentions or opinions that legislators can introduce and vote on. And then there's also memorials, which I'm not going to go into in depth, but they typically are used to honor people, often former legislators, but sometimes can also encourage Congress to do things. We're not going to get into those today. So really what we're focusing on are bills. This is how the state typically explains the policy process. And it is a really useful document, but I also don't think it is the most accessible. And a lot of people see this and immediately think, I don't understand how to follow this, and this is too complicated, and I'm not even going to try. So I do have this on my bulletin board, but it's not what I would recommend for people who are just sort of trying to get a handle on how this works and where it makes sense for them to pay attention or to get involved. So I'm going to try to break this down into a few simpler steps today. So we're going to talk quickly and in sort of an abridged way about how a bill really becomes a law in Colorado. We're going to give you the textbook version, which is the Schoolhouse Rock version. Hopefully all of you enjoyed this in elementary school and junior high as much as I did. And then we're also going to give you the cynics version. So this is kind of the lobbyist version, the inside track. What are their differences in what's supposed to happen versus what might actually be happening? So first, there's a drafting stage. This is when bills are just concepts and they're coming together. A lot of this actually happens in the fall. So September, October are great times to be working on bill concepts if you want to see something happen. When you get into the legislative session, it's often too late. Bills have already been due for many legislators, and so that's just an aside that much of this happens in the summer and fall. The Schoolhouse Rock version is that our lovely state legislators listen to citizens' concerns, they talk with their constituents, and then they draft bills based on that. And again, these stakeholder groups are working through the summer and fall to put those bills together. The Cynics version, or the Cynics edition probably, is that this is a key part of the process where lobbyists work. Bills often are private, essentially, until they are introduced, or unless you get a legislator to share an advanced copy with you. Legislators rarely write their own bills, and they often are not the ones who initially come up with their bill ideas. They do hear stories from constituents, and they also hear from lobbyists what they want to see, and then they take those ideas and with help, they turn those into bills. And so this is an area where lobbyists can be really impactful. Bills then are introduced, what they call being read across the desk. So that's when the Speaker of the House or the Senate President assigns them a number and sends them to the first committee. It may be the only committee in each chamber, but all bills in Colorado have to have a committee hearing, which is actually not the case in most states and is one of those good government laws that I mentioned earlier. So when a bill goes to committee, these are all open to the public. There's a public testimony period in addition to testimony from groups or individuals that the legislators have invited to speak. Legislators on that committee then will listen, consider what they hear, and then make a decision on how to vote on the bill. The Cynics version of this is that most legislators in most situations know how they're going to vote when they walk into the hearing. This isn't always the case. I have absolutely seen legislators listen to testimony, be really affected by it, ask good questions, and then say something like, I thought I was going to vote this way walking into this hearing today, and now I've changed my mind. But I would say that that is absolutely the exception and not the rule. Legislators have to vote on a ton of bills. They don't have the time, frankly, to understand all of them in great detail. And so often, testimony is too late if you're looking to really influence how legislators think about or understand a bill. It's still a really important part of the process, and I would encourage anyone here to go testify on a bill. It's an important part of the record, and it can change minds, but typically the decisions are already made at that point. So after a bill clears its committee or committees, it goes first to the floor of either the House or the Senate. It passes on a voice vote that's called second reading. We're going to skip over that. And then it has to pass again on a recorded vote, and that's called third or final reading. Schoolhouse Rock version here is there's a short debate and then a final vote in each chamber, hypothetically short debate or no debate, because it should have all already happened by the time it gets to that third reading. It's been through a committee hearing and that second reading. But often the Senate and increasingly the House have saved this substantive debate for third reading, and even though bills have already been through a committee hearing or more than one and a second reading, sometimes we're seeing additional debate and amendments and things added on third reading, and that can just slow down the process a bit. Once bills pass this whole process in their first chamber, either the Senate or the House, then they go to the other one and it starts all over again, right? They get read across the desk, they get assigned to a committee or committees, second reading, third reading. If the version of a bill that passes the House and then the Senate is different, it then has to go to another group called a conference committee. So there are lots of other steps in here that I'm happy to talk about in more detail later. But if it makes its way all the way through this process, it goes to the governor's desk, and Governor Polis now gets to consider every bill and either sign it or veto it. Cynic's version here is that while John Hickenlooper was in office, he hardly ever vetoed anything. Some people will say that that's because Governor Hickenlooper didn't love rocking the boat, right? He wasn't a big fan of doing things like vetoes, which I think you can say is true. But on top of that, all the fights over bills had already happened in the legislature, right? In the split party control scenario. And so few things that were ever really controversial made it to his desk. And so once it got there, it was generally more of a formality. Although I think last year he did veto 8 or 9 bills, which was by far the most he has ever vetoed. or did veto during his time in office. Our General Assembly actually has a great website now, which did not used to be the case, but I'd encourage you to check it out. You can click and see what committees exist and what legislators sit on them with pictures. You can find your own legislators by putting in your address. You can search for bills by number or subject or keyword, and so this is definitely worth bookmarking and exploring if you haven't yet. I'm not going to say much about the local policy process because it looks different across the state depending on what community you are in. One note here is that city councils typically will consider ordinances instead of bills. So if you hear the word ordinance, that's referring to the same thing, but is called something different at the city level. And they do have public hearings for bills, just like at the state legislature, but the rules and the format totally depend on your municipality. So again, that's something that is worth researching at your local level, or if you ever have questions or you would like a community presentation where we can come out and tell you a little bit more about how that works, we'd be happy to do that. I don't think we have time to share out, but I'm just going to pose a couple of questions for you to think about. If you have successfully navigated this process before at either the state or local level or both, thinking about how you learned to do that, and if you have tips to share with others about what's been helpful for you, whether it's timing, whether it's how you talk to elected officials, whether it's, phone calls have been better than emails or something like that. Those are really helpful things to share within your policy committee and within CPHA, because I think the best way to learn often is from each other. Okay, so still talking really quickly, but that was the end of our second section about the policy process. Hoping everyone is still with me here. We're going to talk quickly now about how you can get involved. Just a note before we talk about some specific options, I wanted to acknowledge the difference and sometimes confusion over education versus advocacy versus lobbying. This is a diagram that I stole from NACCHO, but I thought this did kind of a nice job of explaining some of the difference between education, advocacy, and lobbying. And they give specific example statements here if you're talking about tobacco use, of what that might look like. If you're trying to educate, which is essentially sharing data, advocate, which is saying something like local health departments are really important in this effort, hint, hint, you should support us. And lobbying, which is saying, I am looking at this specific bill that you are voting on tomorrow, and I'm asking you to vote yes or no. And so that line can be sort of confusing, but I know that you have many resources to help you if you're not quite sure where you might be falling on that spectrum. And then in terms of playing by the rules, this is really important. The CPHA directors can provide more information about guidelines for your specific advocacy or education work. And I think they may make some comments after the presentation wraps up just to give you some extra detail around that. But you need to think about guidelines for yourself as an individual and also as an employee or as a policy committee member. That may look different depending on the capacity in which you're acting at any given time. Work time versus personal time tends to carry different rules with it for many employers, especially if you work for the government. It's really important to know your employer's policy. Some government offices or others will have rules that you can't do anything that qualifies as advocacy or lobbying on your work time or even on your work equipment, right? You might not be able to make a call using your work phone or do something using your work computer that's considered advocacy. So just important to be clear on that in advance. And then CPHA does contract with a lobbying firm. It's actually one that CHI has worked with as well. We, again, don't lobby, but we do sometimes work with lobbyists who help us monitor what's happening at the legislature just so we can stay informed. So you do have additional resources there. And Frontline, who I know you work with, is a wonderful resource, and they know a lot about public health at the Capitol. Okay, so let's talk about a few ways to engage now in the policy process. This can look like writing or calling your legislator or your city council member. Depending on who you talk to, some people will say they really prefer to get phone calls. Some people will say they really prefer to get emails. In my personal experience, I actually have found email to be a little more effective, which is not what I was expecting. but legislators are often in committee hearings and they're on their phones scrolling through messages, and they like being able to have things in writing. Calling can also be really effective if you happen to get a hold of them. You can often go shadow your representative or senator or city council representative for a day or part of a day. They really like having constituents show up and showing an interest in how they work, and will often let you come to meetings with them. And so I think that this is something that not enough people do. You can go attend a hearing just to sit and listen. So again, state and city council hearings are public. That's something that you can just show up for and listen. You can take it a step further and go to a hearing where you actually testify on a bill or an ordinance at the local level that you care about. You can organize a stakeholder group. This is often a way that legislators get bill ideas or take an idea and then try to get community input to figure out what it should look like. And often they don't have the time to do that, and they need people who are interested and have expertise in a topic that they might not. And so that can be a helpful way to offer yourself as a resource too. A lot of different factors influence legislators' decisions. So constituent stories are a huge one, and these are things that often tend to stick with legislators and that they really like sharing in committee hearings. I think it makes policy ideas more tangible to them and to other legislators. So this is State Rep Dylan Roberts. He represents some of the mountain communities up by Vail and Steamboat, and he's here with a kiddo from his district who talked to him about a bill idea and actually worked with him and got a bill passed last year. So this is very impactful, and all of you have your own state representatives, all of you are constituents, so this can be a really great way to talk with them. Personal experiences, so this includes constituent stories, but also things like what have they experienced personally, or their family or their friends. Often they'll talk about how that gave them an insight into a problem that they didn't know was there before. Philosophical beliefs, so this includes things like what does a legislator think is the correct role of government? And this comes into play a lot when we talk about health and healthcare and public health. Is it, for example, the place of government to get involved in mental health issues or sexual health issues through funding or programs? Or are these things more about personal responsibility? So this will really color how legislators typically tend to vote. Facts are not number one on this list. You may have noticed I put them at 4, which may be generous sometimes. So at CHI, we love facts, we love data. This is certainly important. But for most legislators, it is not the number one thing that influences how they vote, but it's always a good idea to back up what you're saying with facts. Proximity to an election can also really affect things. So legislators typically are more willing to back or vote on controversial legislation when it's not an election year. The closer you get to an election, the more worried they get about a vote being used against them, or someone cherry picking a line from a bill or from a committee hearing and then sending out flyers, which many of you probably received before last November's election. And so the further you are from an election, often the more significant or controversial proposals they're willing to consider. And then party leadership also impacts this. So who the Speaker of the House and the Senate President are, what do they think is important, what are their priorities? As I mentioned earlier, they're the ones who read bills across the desk and then decide what committees they go to. And so if they don't want something to pass, it doesn't mean it won't, but it does mean that it's harder. This is something that I saw from another group that gave a presentation to the Colorado Medical Society, and I thought it was really well done, and also because we don't do advocacy. I personally don't do a lot of these types of visits, but wanted to share this with you all. So their template for an effective legislator visit is first, to be on time, right? They are really busy. They often run late, but you absolutely should not be late. You should be very clear about the reason for your visit. They may only have 10 or 15 minutes to meet with you. You should tell a story to illustrate your position and goals. Stories stick with legislators better than facts in most cases, so that's a great way to start. If you are asking them about a specific piece of legislation and it's not something they are sponsoring, it's helpful to briefly explain it because they don't know all the ins and outs of all the bills that they vote on. Leaving a short, handout, one page is recommended with them, can be really useful. Something that they maybe can put on a bulletin board. If it's longer than that, most of them tend not to read it. You want to end on time because, again, you want to show that you're cognizant that they have busy schedules and that you're respectful of that. Thank them, obviously. Sometimes they'll just meet with a staffer instead of a legislator, or in addition, staffers are really powerful in terms of scheduling meetings and responding to you, and so make sure to thank the staff as well. And then I thought this was kind of funny, but also smart. They suggested that you take a group photo, like a really good group selfie with the legislator or staffer, share it on social media or with your local newspaper or online newsletter, thanking them for meeting with you. It gives them some public kudos for taking the time to sit down with you, and also reminds them that you were there. So it can be a useful thing to do. All right, just on to our last few slides. These are just examples of a couple of our current state senators, Don Coram and Larry Crowder, meeting with constituents in their districts and at the Capitol, so this does happen a lot. If you want to speak at a legislative hearing, they take place during our state session Monday through Friday, and for select interim committees that meet between May and January when the next session starts. Speakers sign up before the hearing, or you can be asked by a legislator to come and speak, and then they'll already have your name on a list, and they'll typically tell you the order in which they want you to go. If you're just showing up to share your opinion, they'll typically have all of that public testimony wait until everyone that they've scheduled is done speaking. So this is the biggest committee room at the Capitol in the photo, but there are 6 or 7 different ones, and some of them are much smaller. Speaking at a city council hearing, surprise, depends on your city, so there's not a blanket set of rules here. Most city councils have an online calendar to show when the council and committees, if they have them, meet. You need to sign yourself up. Some cities will not allow a proxy, so that means you need to be there in time before the committee hearing starts to sign yourself up. Others will let a friend go and sign you up before. And then you need to figure out if you are wanting to share general comments about something in the city that you're concerned about or want to bring to their attention, or if you want to give specific comments on an ordinance that they're considering, because often the length of time you have and when you speak in the meeting agenda will depend on that. And then you should know your time limit, because they are strict and typically will cut you off. 2 minutes or 3 minutes goes by really, really quickly, and so try to practice before you get there just to make sure you can say what you want in the time that you have. And then just a final note, if nothing else, relationships really matter. I like this quote a lot from a speaker that I read who was talking about advocacy with a physician group, essentially that the key to being successful is establishing relationships, because relationships lead to trust, and legislators tend to lack time to determine on their own what they think about everything. So it's really important for them to have relationships with people they trust, because often that's how they decide how they're going to vote, right? Because they just don't have time to consider everything else. One last bonus resource I wanted to flag for you. If you haven't seen this, this is an awesome resource that the Colorado Sun put together. I put the link down there at the bottom, but it's called A Citizen's Guide to Lawmaking and Lobbying. It came out just a few weeks ago on January 4th and includes lots of great resources on what's in the Capitol and where do you go, and more about like what does a committee hearing look like. And so I would highly suggest that you bookmark that if you haven't already checked it out. So we are at the end of our time together. Before some Q&A and before some comments by the directors, as a reminder, our 3 key takeaways are that Colorado was hit by this blue wave or blue tsunami maybe in November, but politics are a lot more complicated and not necessarily blue or red or purple at local levels. Second, the bills follow this track from when they're drafted, introduced to passed or failed. That includes a lot of unspoken rules and caveats about how things actually work. And then there are all these great opportunities to get involved in the policy process in Colorado at both the state and the local level. So I encourage you to do that if you haven't already. That's all that I have today. I think we have close to 15 minutes left for the directors to add anything that they would like, or anything that they want to clarify, and then maybe take some Q&A as well. So thank you all so much for your attention and spending your lunch hour with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Allie. And if you don't mind, we'll have you unshare your slides now so that Amy can chat for a minute, and then we'll come back to Q&A.
Absolutely. See if I can just. Oh, how do I unshare?
Hi. Well, I don't have any slides, so I'm not sure of the technicalities there, but I also want to say thank you, Allie, very much for your very informative presentation. And I'm sure that it will spark interest among CPHA members in participating in our public policy work. And that's terrific because there are some great opportunities coming up for them to do so. Hi, everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Amy Winterfeld, CPHA's 2019 Senior Public Policy Director. And I'd also like to give a shout out to my wonderful colleague, Caitlin Wolf, who is CPHA's Junior Policy Director this year and who worked behind the scenes to help organize this webinar for all of you and is also available on this call as a resource and to CPHA members for that purpose too. So now that you're fully informed about Policy 101, we invite you to leap into the Colorado policy process with CPHA's Policy Committee. A major way for you to do so is to follow Allie's suggestion and visit the state capitol with us for Public Health Day on February 14th from 8 a.m. to 12 noon. This event gives us a chance to put a face on public health at the Capitol, and we'd love to have all of your beautiful and diverse faces there to help us do that. This day is sponsored by both CPHA and the Colorado School of Public Health, and it's an event that will give you a chance to see Colorado's legislature in action. We'll enjoy a Valentine's Day breakfast at the Capitol while networking with public health colleagues, and state legislators in the past have also dropped by both for breakfast and to chat with us. So it could be an opportunity for you to chat with them just over breakfast in a very casual setting. The formal program will begin at 9 a.m. It will include remarks from leaders of both of our partner organizations and from state legislators themselves. And those who would like will receive training from CPHA's on-the-ground lobbyist at the Capitol, Diana Protopapa of Frontline Public Affairs, about how to meet their own legislators directly. And you'll also be able to buddy up with a partner for this optional part of the program from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. to visit with your legislator. So please be a schoolhouse rocker, not a cynic, on February 14th. Your state representatives need to hear from you about what's important to you, to your community, and to public health. I also want to mention that a lucky few attendees on February 14th will have a chance to visit the floor of Colorado's Senate and House, which is a pretty awesome experience. And others of you will be able to visit the gallery and watch the Senate and the House in action. As a reminder, please register online if you'd like to attend this event so we can include you in our breakfast count. The registration link is in the chat box now, I believe. And so copy that or note it so that you can register for the event and so that we can have breakfast for you and know that you're coming and provide you with any advanced materials. And for those of you for whom one inspiring day at the Capitol just is not enough, as a CPHA member, you're also welcome to join the Public Policy Committee and participate in monthly Zoom calls during which we learn about specific 2019 legislation and recommend a formal CPHA position on each bill to CPHA's board. If you are interested in joining the CPHA Policy Committee and participating on those calls, please email cphapolicy16 at gmail.com and we will happily add you to the committee roster. One more reminder for CPHA members. Please complete CPHA's 2019 Policy Priority Survey. It's open through January 30th. You should have received a CPHA email with a link for that. And your vote definitely does count in that process. So we encourage you to participate in that so that you can help shape our CPHA policy priorities for this year's 2019 legislative session, where there is so much opportunity for public health. So now I will hand the baton back to you, Marissa, for the Q&A portion of this webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Allie. We did get a few questions throughout the presentation. First for Allie, so I'll go ahead and pose a few of those. And if anybody else has questions, you can feel free and type those now. Or when I finish asking the questions that were in the chat box already, I'll open it up so you can unmute yourself if you'd rather ask your question directly. So the first question for Allie is, during an election, aren't city council candidates listed with a party affiliation? I think there was some confusion about their party affiliation.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would like to research this to make sure. I was thinking the answer to that was no, but if anyone remembers for sure voting, like if you voted last fall on your city councilors, was anyone here able to remember that there was a party affiliation listed? I think in my city there was not, and I know the last time I voted in Denver, I don't believe there was either.
Got it, thank you. So feel free, looks like someone who said not in Boulder. If you have any other thoughts, feel free and type those in the chat box as well. And we can get back to you on that too.
Yeah, I'd love to hear if anyone does live in a city where they list party affiliation, but typically you have to go on the internet or on a Facebook page and dig to figure out what the candidates are affiliated with. They're affiliated.
Great. And then the next question was that some folks in the audience have experience giving testimony on bills. And so one person was mentioning that during their testimony, a legislator was on their phone, distracted. And in your experience, what's a good way to get people's attention, hold their attention, and really make sure that they're engaged and listening?
Yeah, it's so hard. So I have testified a couple times, but always as a neutral party. And it's always hard when you watch people who are coming there to share their story, to share something really personal, who are really invested. And then you look up and some of the legislators are like scrolling through their phones or sending emails. Unfortunately, that is really common. That doesn't always happen. And some of them are more prone to doing that than others. But I would say, yeah, first of all, you just want to focus on the ones who are paying attention, right? Because rarely will all of them be on their phones. Some of them are really great about being tuned in and making eye contact and asking good questions. So try to make eye contact and, take comfort in the fact that some of them are listening to you. The more personal and impactful your story is, also the more likely they are to listen. A lot of them will start tuning out if they hear too much data or too many sort of statistics or background information. Personal stories tend to hold their attention better than anything else. And that may or may not fit with what you want to share in your testimony. But I know that is frustrating. And unfortunately, I think that's part of the cynic side of this, is that there's probably always going to be at least one of them on their phone.
Great. And then this echoes a bit of what you shared, but do you feel like there's one best way to stay in touch with current proposed bills and hearings? Is it the state website? Is it the Colorado Sun? What would you suggest?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Colorado Sun, I will say, in their short time so far, has done a really good job of covering a lot of politics. But because we now have this great state website, which didn't used to exist, I found that to be really user-friendly. So what I do for myself to look at current state bills is I set all of the search settings on the bill page and then bookmark it, and it'll actually save, so you can look for House bills from 2019 or Senate bills from 2019, and every time you visit it, that page will be updated. There's unfortunately not a great way to see proposed legislation that hasn't been introduced yet. That is sort of private depending on who's working on it, and so you kind of have to be in the know or part of a stakeholder group to find out about bills that haven't yet been introduced. But if anyone has specific questions on how to navigate the website, I'd be happy to answer them. There is a drop down when you can search for bills on the right side of the screen, and it's got lots of different topics. And I think public health is actually one of the topics that you can select. There's like health and insurance maybe, and then public health. They've changed it a little bit, but you can also use that drop down and then bookmark that specific page. So every time you visit it, it'll show you all the current bills from this session that are tagged as relating to public health. So I think that's a great tool.
Wonderful. Well, we have about 3 more minutes, so I just wanted to see if anybody wanted to unmute themselves and ask Allie if you have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So again, to unmute yourself, you'll go to the bottom of your screen where your mute and stop video button is. You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like.
I just saw a comment that I wanted to point out that Frontline is a great resource for you guys too. They're super helpful at tracking bills and keeping you updated. So that's a resource I should have mentioned also.
Those who join the CPHA Policy Committee, you will receive regular updates on our calls and via a bill tracker that Frontline sends out.
Great. Well, it looks like there are no people who would like to ask questions directly. I wanted to just reiterate a lot of comments that I've been receiving privately saying thank you for this fantastic webinar, fantastic overview. Everyone really appreciates your time, Allie, and thank you, Amy, as well for joining us to provide the opportunities that we can engage in as CPHA members. And so I wanted to address lastly that I'm happy to share this recording or any of the slides with anyone who's interested. I'll be pasting in my email right now if you'd like to go ahead and email me for those resources. And I'm sure Allie as well as Amy would be really happy to answer any further questions you have by email. So I'll just be pasting in their emails to the chat box right now as well. So we hope to have you join us again on a future webinar. And thank you again for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. This was fun. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you'll join us on February 14th at the Capitol.